Hi folks, welcome to the fourth video in our journey of discovering Moffat ancestry. The family tree currently looks like this, but apparently there is someone missing, and that's Mary Moffett, who in the 1871 census was 8 years old, and so should have been born in 1863. If we go back to the 1871 census, we find a Margaret Moffat living with her 3 daughters, Mary, aged 8, Isabella, aged 6, and Jane, aged 2. We have found the birth certificates for Isabella and Jane. And if this is our family, then Margaret would probably have been in the early stages of pregnancy with James. When it comes to the other members of the family, we have concluded that John was staying with his uncle Thomas McMurray, while George was being a dyer in Whitehaven. However, there is no record of a Mary Moffat born to a Moffat and Armstrong around 1863 in the Jarrow index. The minimum information required for a Jarrow index search is the surname of the child, the sex, and a date range, but we can add the child's first name and the district, in this case Carlisle. Carrying out such a search reveals only 2 Mary Moffats born in Carlisle in 1863, one to a mother whose maiden name is Phillips and the other to another whose maiden name is Hullican. However, doing related searches, we find the Moffat-Phillips couple have other children, whereas there is only one child born to a Moffat-Hullican. Acquiring this Mary's birth certificate reveals that she was born on the 25th of June 1863 to a George Moffat, a cotton dyer, and a Mary Hullican at Stansfield Place, Milburn Street. This is the same street as George and Margaret's other children, and there are no other cotton dyers with the name George Moffat. So there are reasons to think that this might actually be the Mary recorded in the census. However, there seems to be no obvious reason why Margaret's maiden name should be different, as there are no records of a Margaret Hullican in earlier censuses. In fact, a search of the Jarrow index draws a complete blank for anyone with the surname Hullican being born between 1837 and 1846 in Carlisle. However, we will return to this puzzle in a later video, but we can probably assume that this really is James's older sister Mary. Which brings us to the 1881 census, and there is no record of a James, George or Margaret Moffat in Carlisle. Since Granda was born in Middlesbrough in 1895, at some point the family must have moved to the northeast, and so the focus of a census search can be redirected to the east side of the Pennines, particularly County Durham, Northumberland and North Yorkshire. When we do this, we find a Margaret Moffat at 29 Chaytor Street in Jarrow, with her sons John, aged 20, and James, aged 9, and a daughter Catherine, aged 5. This would be a completely different set of children from the 1871 census entries. So you do have to ask, what on earth is going on? Is this really the same person? We can see that John and James were born in Carlisle, and are the right ages, 20 and 9, as is Margaret, but Catherine was born in Jarrow. If this is our family, then this would suggest they moved from Carlisle before 1876, but after 1871. Because of a smudge on the image of the census page, it's not really possible to be certain about Margaret's marital status. However, we can investigate the birth of Catherine. A search of the BMD records reveals that a Catherine Moffat, note the spelling, was born to a George Moffat and Margaret Armstrong on the 28th of February 1876 at 22 Shakespeare Street, Jarrow. In Victorian times, it seems the E in Shakespeare was missing on certificates and old maps, but if you look on more recent maps, the E is now there. But meanwhile, this certificate suggests that maybe the Margaret Moffat in the census is the same person as on the birth certificate, although George Moffat is now an iron shipyard labourer and no longer a dyer. On James's birth certificate, George is a general labourer, so we can suggest that the background to this change of occupation may well be the decline of the cotton industry in Carlisle, which was a result of the American Civil War. If cotton dyers were no longer required in Carlisle, then George would have been forced to find employment elsewhere. Hence, he is in Whitehaven in April 1871. However, by October 1871, even that work must have come to an end, and he was forced to become a general labourer. Sadly, although he had the qualifications as a dyer, those skills were no longer needed in the 1870s. However, shipbuilding was expanding up and down the Tyne, as this map shows, which comes from the Tyne Built Ships website. Consequently, it is highly likely that George and his family moved to the northeast in the 1870s to find more secure employment working in a shipyard. Although these two pictures are from some time later, they perhaps give a flavour of what George, Margaret and the rest of the family were moving to. However, as you might expect, questions are raised by the 1881 census, which need to be answered if we are to strengthen the case for the identification of this family as the one we are looking for. What has happened to George Moffat? And what has happened to his three daughters, Mary, Isabella and Jane? There are several possibilities regarding George Moffat. Perhaps he's elsewhere in the country. Maybe he had divorced Margaret. We do know that she married a Kirk at some point. Or maybe he died. Similar questions apply to the three daughters, but rather than being divorced, maybe they had married. Well, maybe just Mary. We shall see. A search of the 1881 census reveals 6 George Moffats born around 1841, although none are married to a Margaret or have the correct occupation or are born in Carlisle. However, a search of the BMD index for possible deaths reveals a George Moffat of 22 Shakespeare Street, Jarrow, dying on the 28th of June 1879 of delirium tremens. That would suggest that George may have been an alcoholic. The certificate records he was 38 years old and his occupation was an iron shipyard labourer. Therefore, given his age, born in approximately 1841, and the address from Catherine's birth certificate, this is almost certainly the husband of Margaret Moffat and the father of James Moffat. While conducting this search, I also discovered that Jane Moffat of 22 Shakespeare Street, Jarrow, died on the 24th of June 1879 of typhoid fever. So late June 1879 would have been a very sad time for Margaret, losing her husband and one of her daughters. But there's an interesting entry on Jane's death certificate in that the informant is her sister, Mary Moffett, living at the same address. So we now know that she was living in Jarrow 2 years before the next census. Meanwhile, on a hunch, given that James was born in 1871 in Carlisle and Catherine was born in 1876 in Jarrow, it's possible that another child may have been born between those two dates. If this were the case, it would help to refine when the family moved across the Pennines. A search of the BMD index reveals that a Hannah Moffat was born on the 22nd of June 1874 at 22 Shakespeare Street, Jarrow. Sadly, it turns out that she died 7 months later, on the 12th of February 1875, of scarlet fever. So with James born in Carlisle in 1871 and Hannah born in Jarrow in 1874, the family must have moved sometime in 1872 or 1873. So we've now accounted for the absence of George and Jane in the 1881 census, but the question remains of where are Mary and Isabella? There is a potential candidate for Isabella Moffat, a domestic servant who's working for the Warwick family of 82 Ormond Street, Jarrow, which is very close to Shakespeare Street. She is 16 years old, which would give a birth year of 1865, and the census records the birthplace as Carlisle, so this is very likely our Isabella. We can now update the family tree again, adding not just Mary, but also Hannah and Catherine. But we are again left with the question of where was Mary in 1881? She has this habit of being elusive. We will resume the search for her in the next video.